Hello, class. This is lecture number 5 for History 102, and we're picking up in chapter 27 on Empire and Expansion, America Becoming a World Power, and we're also going to the coinciding mini lectures that you'll find on Moodle and where this will be posted. And the first thing we want to talk about is what happens in Hawaii. Now, Hawaii, the first white Americans to ever go to Hawaii went there in the 1820s, and they were missionaries from New England. Now, they'll go there and set up missions and so forth and get along pretty well with the Hawaiian people. And one thing you have to realize about Hawaii, Hawaii was its own country. Hawaii had kings and queens and were quite organized. In fact, you'll see a portrait of their most famous queen on page 623 in your book, Queen Liliuokalani. Now, relations with the United States and Hawaii will start to really pick up in 1875. That's when the Hawaiian government and the United States government signs a document known as the Reciprocity Agreement. And what it does is it allows Hawaii to sell its number one product, sugar, in America without paying any tariffs. Now remember how high the tariffs were. We talked about that previously, back when we were meeting on campus. This is a big deal for the Hawaiians because their sugar will be cheaper than any other country's sugar in America, and it's a big economic boost to the Hawaiians. What the United States gets out of this deal is Hawaii basically agrees to be our best buddies. They're not going to ally or sign agreements with any other nations, just between us and Hawaii. So, that's going to go on, and the Hawaiians will prosper from that. From 1775, the next big agreement that'll take place between the United States government and the Hawaiians is the Pearl Harbor Agreement of 1887. The Hawaiian government allows us to build a naval station at Pearl Harbor, which is very significant for us because, remember, the frontier is going to close in 1890. We're going to have to venture off the Pacific coast, and Hawaii becomes a very significant refueling station and naval base smack dab in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Hawaii is way out there in the Pacific. From Los Angeles, it's 2 time zones away. So, this is significant. The Hawaiian government and us are getting along very well, and they say, sure, no problem. You can build your naval station there on our territory. Then, the next thing that happens is something we covered earlier in class, and it's part of that $1 billion Congress of 1890, the McKinley Tariff Act. Remember, they went on that spending spree, spent too much money, and then they had to raise tariffs to come up with the additional revenue they needed. The McKinley Tariff Act reestablished tariffs on Hawaiian sugar. Now, obviously, this was pretty unpopular in Hawaii. And, if you look at it from a Hawaiian perspective, we got exactly what we wanted out of them, the ability to build Pearl Harbor, and then we turn our backs on them and start charging them taxes again. So, what's going to happen next in Hawaii, in 1893, there's going to be a revolt. And the revolution in Hawaii is not led by angry Hawaiians. It's led by white Hawaiians who are the descendants of those missionaries from New England. They're even known as, quote unquote, the missionary boys. They will rise up against Queen Liliuokalani because she's attempting to give the Hawaiian people even more rights modeled after the Bill of Rights in the United States. They don't like this because they own large sugar plantations, so they oust the queen. They take over the palace. Luckily, Queen Liliuokalani escapes unharmed, but now this handful of the missionary boys are in charge of Hawaii. This happens in 1893. Now, when word of this revolt comes to Pearl Harbor, the naval commander there, not knowing what was going on and thought that the Queen was in danger, which she was, sends 150 U.S. Marines to the palace to find out what's going on. When they get there, much to their surprise, they see it's these missionary boys who are revolting. So they're not going to open fire on former U.S. citizens or descendants of those, so they turn around and go back to Pearl Harbor. A lot of Hawaiians misinterpreted this and thought we were assisting the missionary boys, which we weren't. Now, this ultimately is going to lead to the United States finally, during the Spanish-American War in 1898, annexing Hawaii and making it part of the United States, even though most Hawaiians weren't in favor of that. They, if they had their way, would have reestablished Queen Liliuokalani as their leader and would have remained an independent nation. President Cleveland wouldn't annex it. In 1893, after the rebellion, because he had an investigation and said that's not the best course of action. But because they were under threat from the Spanish, who were a Pacific power at the time, the United States annexes them in 1898 under emergency measures, and then ultimately, obviously, they become the 50th state in 1959. So, what we want to talk about next in this saga of America becoming a world power, sort of leading our way to the Spanish-American War, is what happens in Cuba. There's a revolt in Cuba in 1895. Cuba is a Spanish colony. It's been held by Spain dating all the way back to when Columbus came here. And it's one of the last prizes of the Spanish Empire because, similar to Hawaii, it has a very valuable sugar production that takes place there. The Spanish have been treating the native Cubans horribly for centuries, and finally in 1895, the Cubans rise up and revolt against the Spanish. The Spanish were not ready to just give Cuba its independence because it was so valuable to them. So they're going to send a force of Spanish soldiers from Spain, led by a general by the name of Weyler, to Cuba to crush this rebellion. This force sent there by Spain is 200,000 troops strong, so they're not fooling around. General Weyler quickly gains the nickname of the Butcher because he's ruthless against these Cuban rebels. Now, how the United States ties into this, by this point in history, there's a significant number of Cuban Americans who have moved here from Cuba, and unlike today, they haven't settled in Miami, Florida. They settled in New York City, and there's even a neighborhood of Little Cuba or Little Havana. Now, some of them prominent businessmen, are backing the Cuban rebels. They'd love to see their old homeland gain its independence from its Spanish oppressors. So they're sending shiploads of weapons to help arm the Cuban rebels. Spain knows this. So what's going to happen during General Weyler's tirade in Cuba, a lot of people will be arrested and thrown into prisons. Some of them are not combatants. They're just political rebels. And they're going to be held in these, what they, still termed back then concentration camps, and caught in the fray are a lot of Americans because there were American businessmen who also operated in Cuba. Now, this is going to become an American issue because of the stories being told about the brutality of General Weyler and his Spanish troops, and some of it being aimed at American citizens who were caught in the fray. And newspapers of the time are going to have a field day with this, and they're going to print a lot of stories which are really based in fantasy, I suppose. This is the time period of American journalism history known as yellow journalism. Remember, newspapers are the name of the game still in the 1890s, and there's a tremendous amount of competition to sell papers. In New York City alone, in the 1890s, there's more than a dozen daily newspapers, all competing for readers. So they're more like tabloids that you see at the grocery counter with made-up stories about the brutality that's going on down in Cuba. So, because of the things that these yellow journalistic stories stir up in America, now President McKinley has to take action. He starts negotiating with the Spanish, and he gets them to back down in Cuba. He gets them to recall the general, the butcher, Weyler, back to Spain, relinquish him of command. He gets them to release all political prisoners from the prisons that they were being held in Cuba, and he secures the release of all American citizens. Now, this sort of brings an end to the Cuban rebellion, but the Spanish prevail because of their dominant military force there. But this is really, as far as the United States, where the story just really starts to unfold. Because what President McKinley will do next is he will send one American steel battleship, the USS Mae, to the harbor in Havana. Now, this brings up a different issue. Something that the United States did during the 1880s, which was really going to set the stage for us becoming a world power in the 1890s and forward, is we made the very smart decision of building a steel navy. England had done so, and some other countries had. It was a big, costly transition to shift from a wooden navy to a steel navy. The United States did so, and they built a fleet known as the Great White Fleet, because all of our steel battleships were painted white back then. One of those ships, the USS Mae, was sent to the harbor in Havana. Now, McKinley kind of did this out of the blue. He didn't warn the Spanish, and all of a sudden the Mae is anchored out there. They wonder, what's the Mae doing here? McKinley tells the Spanish it's there for safety reasons. In case all hell breaks loose in Cuba again, it will be there to evacuate American citizens off of Cuba so they don't end up mistakenly being captured and put in prisons. And he says the Mae's going to sit there until further notice. Spain's not happy about this, but there's nothing they can do about it. Spain was not one of the countries that built a steel navy. They still had an old, antiquated wooden navy. So they couldn't force the Mae out of the harbor in Havana. So it's bobbing around out in the harbor, a constant reminder that the United States is flexing its muscle to the Spanish in Cuba. Now, what's going to happen next in this saga, which is going to lead us into war with Spain, is a famous letter is going to be uncovered and printed in newspapers in the United States. This famous letter is known as the De Lome letter. De Lome is the Spanish minister in the embassy in Washington, D.C. He's like their ambassador to the United States. This letter from Delome that he sent back to Spain to a friend of his, it was a private letter, it wasn't an official government correspondence or anything, was stolen out of the U.S. mail by a reporter for the New York Journal, one of these yellow journalism newspapers operating out of New York City. And they're going to print the entire content of this stolen letter on the front page of the New York Journal, and then it'll appear on newspapers all across the United States. In this personal letter from Ambassador Delome, or Minister Delome, to his friend, he's obviously answering questions that his friend posed to him earlier. His friend wanted to know, what's President McKinley really like? Delome had met with him on several occasions. Delome told his friend that he wasn't impressed. He said his impression of President McKinley was he was a weak would-be politician and not impressive at all. Because people back in Spain thought he was this very powerful person, flexing his muscles, sending the Maine down there to Havana Harbor and so forth, getting them to withdraw the butcher whaler as the general. His friend had also asked him, what's really going on here? Are we just bending over backwards to the United States? Are we that afraid of him? And basically, Delome told his friend, don't read everything you read in the newspapers in Spain. We're making a bunch of false promises to the Americans that we have no intent of keeping. It's all just propaganda, so don't believe it. We're not afraid of him, and we certainly aren't afraid of President McKinley. So, this letter is published on the front page of newspapers all across the United States on February 9th, 1898. Now, timing is going to be very important here. So all Americans are reading about the Delome letter, where basically the French minister calls our president a chump and says Spain's just lying through their teeth. That happens on February 9th. Here's what happens next. On February 15th, and if you look at the famous painting on page 625 in your book, the USS Mae explodes in Havana Harbor. It sinks to the bottom of the harbor and it kills 260 American sailors. Now, this horrible disaster takes place on February 15th. Remember, the Delome letter's fresh in everybody's mind from reading it on February 9th. Immediately, the public in America that's been all fired up by the yellow journalists to begin with want to go to war with Spain. They're marching in the streets, chanting, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain." President McKinley says, whoa, hold on a minute. We have to find out what really happened here before we take any action about this. So he sends an investigative crew down to Havana Harbor to see what happened to the Maine. Spain has its own investigating team looking into the same thing. And they do their investigation, and two different reports come out. The U.S. report indicates that a submarine mine, because Havana Harbor was mined for submarines, yes, there were submarines by the 1890s, the Germans were way ahead in that technology, had been cut loose and it drifted into the Maine. And when it hit the Maine, it blew up and exploded the ship and sank it and killed those 260 sailors. That's the U.S. version. The Spanish version concluded that an accidental internal combustion of probably coal on board the Maine caused its demise. Now, one thing you have to realize here, in any event like this, it's the perception of what happened at the time that really determines the future events. So, Americans are reading their newspapers that supposedly Spain unwittingly blew up the Maine. What do you think they want? They want war. Spain's saying, no, we didn't. Now, here's what happens in 1976. A team of scientists and divers is sent to Havana Harbor by National Geographic Society. They do a modern study of what actually happened to the Maine. Their conclusions in 1976, an accidental internal explosion probably caused by coal blew up the Maine. That's what the Spanish team concluded all the way back in 1898. Problem is, this is 1976. It's nice to know, but it had no bearing on what's going to happen. So, obviously what's going to happen here pretty quickly, even though McKinley does his best to calm people down, by April 11th, 1898, he has no choice but go to Congress and deliver his declaration of war speech, urging the House and the Senate to declare war on Spain in retaliation for the sinking of the Maine. So, that's the events that lead up to the Spanish-American War. The next time I deliver a lecture to you, which will probably be Sunday or Monday, because tomorrow I'm going to go fishing, I'm going to talk about the very famous Spanish-American War, Theodore Roosevelt and the Rough Riders, and before you know it, we'll be electing Theodore Roosevelt President of the United States, one of my biggest heroes. So you all take care. Have a good weekend. It's going to be nice out, but obviously practice social distancing. I can just fish in my backyard, so I don't have to worry about anybody coming close to me except for the fish, hopefully. So be safe, stay home, and I'll talk to you next time about the Spanish-American War. Bye.